Welcome to another deep dive. This week we're going to be looking at something kind of unique.
Yeah.
The very first week of Donald Trump's second term
Second term.
as president, and you've given me...
As president of the United States, yes.
Yes, thank you,
Of course.
of the United States. You've given me a really fascinating collection of sources to dig into.
Yeah, it's a wild week.
It is a wild week. We've got a sermon transcript, we've got some news articles from a variety of different sources, and we even have some online discussions.
I mean, it really does feel like a chaotic time.
It does. So this deep dive is going to explore the key events, the controversies, and the reactions that kind of defined this very specific week.
I think chaos is a good word for it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I think so. So why don't we start with the National Cathedral's inaugural prayer service?
All right.
It's not really the place that you expect political clashes.
You would think it would be above that, right?
Right.
But it wasn't.
But it wasn't.
Uh-huh.
So the Episcopal Bishop of Washington, Marian Boudet, she used her sermon to directly address President Trump.
Okay, and this is important to note. This isn't their first interaction.
Right. Fill me in.
Bishop Boud has been pretty critical of Trump before this moment.
Mm-hmm.
Most notably back in 2020 when Trump had that photo op at St. John's Episcopal Church.
Oh, yeah, after they cleared out the protesters.
Exactly right.
And there was a lot of controversy there.
Yeah, a lot of religious leaders at the time really condemned that. They felt like he was using religious symbols to kind of bolster political gain.
Yeah, for sure. So knowing that background, it's even more interesting that Bishop Boud used this platform to call on Trump to show mercy towards the LGBTQ plus community and also undocumented immigrants.
Yeah, and what's interesting is this very small interaction kind of reveals this larger conflict that's brewing between the more traditional religious institutions and this rise in political populism that we see. So essentially both are kind of competing to hold the moral authority in a society that is changing very rapidly.
And Trump's reaction?
Well, he wasn't happy. He called for an apology from the bishop, called the service boring and uninspiring. And he even went so far as to label Boud a radical left Trump hater.
It's kind of surreal to imagine a president criticizing a prayer service like that.
Yeah, it really highlights how deep this polarization ran at the time.
Yeah.
And it wasn't just the president versus the bishop either. The absence of really any prominent evangelical leaders, despite their unwavering support for Trump, really adds another layer here.
It makes you wonder, does that signal some kind of growing rift between Trump and the evangelical community? Or was it maybe a more calculated decision to kind of lay low during this event?
It's a good question.
Yeah.
And it's one worth considering. But while this symbolic battle was playing out at the National Cathedral, Trump was very busy taking concrete steps to impact millions of Americans through a series of executive orders.
Right. And these executive orders seemed to come out of nowhere and really sent shockwaves through the country.
Yeah, they did.
One that immediately grabbed the headlines was Trump's decision to withdraw the U.S. from the World Health Organization. Again, he tried this before in 2020, right?
He did. He claimed that the WHO was mishandling the COVID-19 pandemic and that they were far too influenced by China.
Uh-huh.
But this time around, the global health community was far more concerned than the first time.
Well, yeah. I mean, the pandemic was still ongoing, and scientists were worried that cutting the U.S. off from the WHO would actually hinder efforts to prevent and respond to future health crises.
Right. It really felt like a step backwards for international cooperation.
It did. And then there was the executive order aimed at dismantling the federal diversity, equity, and inclusion programs, the DEI programs.
Yeah, this is a big one.
Yeah.
This really shook things up, especially in the federal workforce.
It was a drastic move. Trump basically said, put all the federal DEI staff on leave and eventually lay them off. He argued that these programs were discriminatory and that hiring should be completely merit-based.
And it's interesting because that really ignited this massive debate about what merit-based even means and whose merits we're actually prioritizing here.
Exactly. Critics argued that dismantling the DDI programs would just worsen the existing inequalities and create a less diverse and inclusive federal workforce.
And it also really sent these ripples of uncertainty throughout institutions in America. Places that were grappling with their own DEI initiatives.
Yeah, it's funny because this whole DEI debate brings up something that happened at my previous job.
Oh.
We were trying to implement a new diversity initiative, and there was so much pushback from certain employees who felt that it was unfair and that it would lead to less qualified people getting hired.
Interesting.
It was really eye-opening to see how deeply some people hold those beliefs.
It just shows how these abstract policy decisions can actually have very real and often emotional consequences for people.
Yeah.
And speaking of policies with a direct impact, Trump also signed an executive order that defines sex as strictly male or female.
Yeah, I remember this one. It felt like a huge step backwards in terms of LGBTQ plus rights.
It did. And it wasn't just about definitions either. This order could affect everything from legal documents to federal prison assignments to even access to health care.
Wow.
Medical groups were very concerned. They pointed out that this definition contradicted the actual scientific understanding of sex and gender.
It's just another example of how these decisions made in Washington, D.C. can have these really personal consequences for people all across the country.
Yeah.
And there's one more executive order from this first week that we have to talk about. The pardon of those involved in the January 6th Capitol attack.
Right, and this one was hugely controversial.
It really was.
Reactions ranged from gratitude from those who were pardoned all the way to condemnation from people who thought it was an insult to justice.
Yeah, it definitely added fuel to the already raging fire of the conversation
Yeah.
about accountability for that attack and the limits of presidential power.
Yeah, and this pardon was part of this larger pattern that really raised questions about abuse of power and this potential erosion of democratic norms.
It was a lot to process in just 1 week. You've got these symbolic clashes like the prayer service incident, these big policy changes with the executive orders, and then just this underlying current of anxiety about what it all means.
Yeah, it was a week that really did test the resilience of American democracy.
It did. So let's take a look at some of the other sources, including a few that I found particularly intriguing.
Right.
Like you included an article about Trump's new meme coin.
Oh, yes. Meme coins, for those who don't know, they are cryptocurrencies that are often associated with some internet trend or a joke, and their value can be really unpredictable.
Uh-huh. But it wasn't just that he released a meme coin, which, by the way, the value skyrocketed immediately. But the article also mentioned how this sparked online discussions about how crypto could be used for bribery,
Hmm.
which I thought was an interesting angle.
It's definitely an angle, and the use of cryptocurrency in any potentially illicit activity is something that regulators and law enforcement are increasingly concerned about these days.
Oh, for sure. Speaking of online discussions, you also included some snippets of conversations about Trump threatening to withhold federal aid from wildfire-ravaged Los Angeles.
Yes, that was another event that caused a lot of heated debate. Trump connected the aid to California's water policies, which he's been critical of for a long time.
It just shows how even natural disasters can be politicized.
Absolutely.
And it also kind of brought up this bigger question of climate change and its impact on increasingly frequent and severe natural disasters.
Which, again, is something that was a point of contention between Trump and California for years.
Right, exactly.
Yeah, it's just a perfect example of how multiple issues can kind of intersect and create a very challenging situation.
They do. And then while all this was going on, there was another development in the TikTok saga.
Oh, yes. TikTok,
TikTok got a temporary reprieve from a potential ban.
a stay of execution.
Yeah, exactly. Trump issued an executive order that gave them 75 more days while his administration determined the appropriate course forward.
I love that vague language.
Yeah, it's very vague. But what was interesting to me was that some legal experts questioned whether Trump even had the authority to issue that order.
That's a great point.
Yeah.
It really highlights how complex and ambiguous the power of the executive branch is when it comes to regulating these social media platforms, which has become a battleground in recent years.
It has. And within all this chaos, there was this one story about individual choice that stood out to me.
Yeah.
It was about Pamela Hemphill, a Boise resident who is nicknamed the MAGA Granny.
Oh, yeah.
She was involved in the January 6th riot,
Okay.
but she rejected Trump's pardon for her role in the attack.
Oh, wow. That is remarkable.
I thought it was fascinating. What was her reasoning?
Well, she basically stated that accepting it would be an insult to law enforcement, to the rule of law, and to the country as a whole.
Wow.
She did not want to be a part of rewriting history or downplaying what happened.
It's a powerful statement. It's like this reminder that even in times of division and uncertainty, individual choices still really matter. She chose to stand by her principles, even if it meant going against the popular opinion.
Her story really speaks to this idea of personal accountability and the courage to stand up for what you believe in, even when it's really difficult.
Yeah, for sure. And I think that's a good place to pause for now.
So,
We've covered a lot of ground, from those symbolic clashes to these sweeping policy changes to these really inspiring acts of conscience.
it's been a lot.
It has. So in part 2, we'll explore how these themes continue to play out and what they really reveal about the state of American democracy during this pretty turbulent time.
I'm ready when you are.
Yeah.
What's so interesting about Hemphill's choice is it really challenges this idea of a single mega movement.
Right.
You have someone here who clearly was a Trump supporter, but drew the line when it came to her own personal sense of right and wrong.
Yeah, it definitely adds some nuance to how we think about this period.
It does.
It reminds us that even within this movement that looked so unified from the outside, there were individuals who were grappling with their own beliefs, making their own choices based on what they thought was right.
Exactly. And her story really brings us back to this tension we were discussing
Oh, you mean the tension between?
between this individual agency and the influence of these powerful figures and ideologies.
Yeah, it's like this constant push and pull between following the crowd and making your own path.
That's a great way to put it. And speaking of powerful figures, let's shift gears a little bit and look at this article you found about the legal challenges to Trump's executive orders.
Oh, yeah.
It seems like a lot of his actions face some pretty immediate pushback.
They did. I was really interested in the challenges to the order defining sex as strictly male or female.
Uh-huh.
The article mentioned that medical groups filed lawsuits arguing that this definition was discriminatory and went against what science says.
This is where things get really interesting legally. These lawsuits bring up these complex questions about the separation of powers, the role of the courts in reviewing these executive actions, and just what the limits are of presidential authority.
It really seemed like this first week just set the stage for some really big legal battles that were to come.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just the legal challenges, there was pushback from inside the government, too.
Oh, right. You included this article about the struggles within different agencies as they tried to figure out how to carry out these orders.
Yeah, it really paints this picture of just confusion, frustration, and even resistance from some career civil servants who felt like some of these orders were misguided or could even cause harm.
Yeah, I remember that article. It was really interesting.
It shows how complex things are. It's
Oh.
not just a top-down situation. There are a lot of competing interests and points of view within the system itself.
It's a good reminder that even with these powerful individuals making decisions, there are checks and balances in place.
Right. And that brings us to another interesting part of your research, the online discussions.
Yeah, these give us a glimpse into how everyday people were reacting to everything as it was happening.
You do.
One thing that was clear was the sheer amount of conversation about the pardon for the January 6th attackers. Everyone had an opinion.
It's understandable. That event had a huge impact and is still shaping political discussions today.
It felt like a turning point in how we talk about political violence and holding people accountable.
And what's interesting is if you compare the online reactions to the pardon versus the withdrawal from the WHO, they're very different.
You're right. With the pardon, it was mainly outrage and condemnation, but with the WHO thing, it was more mixed.
It was. Some people were worried about what it would mean for global health, while others thought it was a good move to stand up for America or hold the WHO accountable.
It just shows how public opinion is complicated. It's shaped by so many different things.
It really is. There's never just one public opinion on anything.
Right. And speaking of complicated public opinions, let's go back to those meme coin discussions.
Ah, yes, those were wild.
People were talking about everything from market manipulation to using them for bribery and money laundering.
It's funny how something like releasing a meme coin, which seems trivial, led to these serious conversations about regulation and ethics.
It shows that cryptocurrency is becoming more and more important, and we need to figure out how to manage it.
We do.
Yeah.
It also highlights how things that seem unrelated, like the meme coin, the pardon, and the WHO withdrawal, are actually connected.
Right. They're all part of these bigger trends that are changing America in big ways.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And as we wrap up this deep dive, we'll look at those bigger themes and what they might tell us about what's to come for American democracy.
Looking back on everything, it's amazing how this 1 week feels like it sums up Trump's whole presidency.
Yeah, you see all the same stuff. The fighting with different groups, using his power in unusual ways, the country being so divided, and just constant chaos and uncertainty.
It's hard to wrap your head around it all, but I think you've done a really good job explaining it.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
I think what's important is to figure out what it all means in the long run. You know, how did it change things politically? How did it affect people's lives? And what can we learn from it?
Those are big questions. Maybe some of those online discussions hold clues. Like when people were wondering if Trump's meme coin could be used for bribery or money laundering.
Right. Those were interesting. It wasn't just about some internet fad. It showed that people were worried about how new tech could be used for bad stuff.
And it wasn't just about crypto. You see the same worry with TikTok and whether our data is safe or if other countries could mess with us.
Exactly. This whole period really showed how tough it is to control new technology. We want to be innovative, but also keep things safe and ethical.
And we're still dealing with that today.
For sure. Which brings us back to something we've been talking about, people not trusting institutions anymore.
Hmm.
The government, the media, even religious groups. It's like people don't believe them like they used to.
And that seems connected to all the misinformation and how divided we are.
It's a bad cycle. When you don't trust anyone, you're more likely to believe lies and conspiracies, which just makes you trust people even less and creates more division.
It's like we're drowning in information and can't tell what's real anymore.
That's why it's so important to think critically and be aware of our own biases.
You know what stands out to me is how much power individuals have. We saw people like Pamela Hempill who stuck to their beliefs even when it was hard.
Her story is so important. It reminds us that we're not just watching all this happen. We have a duty to talk to each other, hold our leaders accountable, and make choices that reflect our values.
It's a call to action. We can't just sit around. We have to try to create the future we want.
I agree. Which brings us to our final thought, the future of American democracy. This 1 week with Trump showed how fragile our system is and how hard we have to work to protect it.
It's a wake-up call. Democracy isn't something you just watch. You have to participate, think critically, and be willing to listen to those who disagree with you.
And it means believing in truth, justice, and working together even when it's tough.
Well said. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into such an important moment in our history. We hope exploring these sources gave you some new insights.
It's been great talking about this with you.
And to you listening, we encourage you to keep thinking about these things, have those tough conversations, and make choices that shape the world you want to live in.